Gone are the days that corporate communications is, we're going to push out a press release, we're going to manage a couple key stakeholders. It's really embedded in everything we do.
You can see how in larger entities, communications manifests in different ways in different parts of the business. And yet it's so critical across so many levels. I think it's a good conversation to have. The pendulum tends to swing back and forth relative to centralized, decentralized. But if we can embrace that both and two things being true at once, I think we're going to be in a much stronger place.
Welcome to Building Brand Gravity. I'm Steve Halsey.
And I'm Anne Green.
And we are your hosts of Building Brand Gravity. Well, today's going to be fun. Today's episode's also going to be a little bit different. We're diving into a mailbag of the big questions that have surfaced across our conversation so far this year. And Anne, we've spoken to some incredible guests, from comms leaders, AI experts, researchers, how really gauging how we think about trust. And what really struck us is how often the themes seem to overlap. They're all very individual episodes, but a lot of them reflect what many of you are grappling with inside your own organizations.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And instead of revisiting each episode one by one, we're just going to weave together questions by theme. And we're looking at the kinds of discussion points we're hearing most from communicators and marketers and leaders. So we can consider this a lightning round of the issues that just keep coming up in boardrooms, in our conversations with ourselves and other agencies, and also in the media. So Steve, I'm going to let you jump right in.
Well, why don't we start with the topic that always comes up when you start the conversation about communications, the stature of communications and where we fit in. In your interview with Chrissy Jones in The Future of the Comms Function, you and Chrissy discuss that off-sided point that, quote unquote, comm needs to earn a seat at the table, right? We've been hearing that for a long time, and it kind of feels outdated. And that's the point you were saying. Yet it continues to come up over and over again. Why is that? And how is the stature of comms in the C-suite still unsettled at this point?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We did talk about that. That was a very recent episode, so I encourage people to check it out. I think about this a lot, why comms has to earn a seat at the table. In many organizations it has. Like, that's not even a question anymore. Yet, I think the continued challenge of how value is measured is probably at the heart of it. The revenue issues, stock price, those hard metrics, the dollars, capital tends to still be the way, especially larger organizations, measure value. The value of things like reputation as a business asset are, of course, and have always been harder to measure. They are qualitative as well as quantitative. And there's been many efforts to put the quantitative number to it, the dollar figure. But those always feel a little bit hollow, or they fall short relative to a literal thing like bottom line revenue or stock price. And so I think that that is going to continue to be a challenge. Yet you and I have been doing some reputation work recently. And in speaking with a whole C-suite of a very, very large organization, it's incredibly clear to those folks that reputation is a business asset and that these pieces are critical. And so I think that we have to find a way to keep articulating that and insisting on both qualitative and quantitative. And the other thing we need to do is remind folks that in a volatile landscape, communications folks and communications functions are more central and necessary than ever.
Well, in a lot of ways, there are people that try and make it be almost like a binary question of, hey, should comms really be sitting in the C-suite right there in the center of power, or should they be out where the customers are in the field with the businesses? How do they balance both? In a lot of ways, I feel like sometimes that's a binary point that's being put out there, but you like to say it's yes and, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of things can be true at once.
So that continues to be part of the challenge, but it really, like you said, it's no longer about having the seat at the table. It's really about what are we going to do there? How do we demonstrate the value? And it's interesting that the role of senior comms has kind of shifted from that, hey, we're kind of the, kind of like that little voice of the organization, kind of steering it on the path to really, like what you were saying, of really thinking about reputation as a value driver, particularly in as volatile environment like we're in today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just don't know that that question's ever going to go away. It's our role is going to be different than a CFO's role or a senior counsel, legal counsel. And I think we just have to embrace the differences there and keep articulating it.
Well, and part of that challenge too, and you and Ethan McCarty covered this in that episode of living with values when culture and brand collides. You guys really talked about the challenges of what happens when organizational and individual employee values are not aligned, sometimes in clear conflict. But isn't it impossible to ever fully achieve alignment between the corporation and the individual? And what kind of expectation should leaders have for employees to truly buy in?
Yeah, when we had the Ethan episode, there was definitely some good feedback there and some discussions even among our own team about that question. There's like the organizational value, the individual's value, because employees are not a monolith, right? How do they overlap? How close are they? Are they one? Or are they the same, right? So, and I had actually reached out to Ethan when they had put out at Integral some good research they do every year about employee values, employee experience, et cetera, because that's their expertise. I think where we were netting out here is that there's no way that the circles completely overlap. That would be something that you wouldn't expect to happen. You shouldn't expect to happen, nor is that probably good. I think there's a dynamic tension between how the organization and its leaders as a collective, and then the individuals in the entity pull and push at each other to find your center of gravity within those values. Now, one thing Ethan said I think is very clear, and I think this is the flag for organizational leaders, but also communications folks that are dealing with internal and external communications. When the circles are too far apart, some very not good things can happen. You want to try to bring them more into alignment. So trying to hope that you can have more of the overlap. But part of that is going through that consistent process frequently and refreshing it of discussing what values really mean at a collective level and at an individual level, and creating an environment where people can speak about where they feel tensions with their own individual values. You don't have to buy into everything. And sometimes it's better if people exit because they don't feel that alignment. But I think that leaders have to be more intentional and mindful about how they speak about this in their own ecosystem. I don't know. Does that resonate with you?
I think it does, and when I had the discussion with Elliot Mizrahi when he was with the Page Society and Rob Yekelek of the Harris Poll, they did some research at the turn of the year, which was really focused on that idea of values, and to the point that you were talking about, how a corporation really needs to stay true and demonstrate and live out those values. And then, like you said, at some point, if they don't align, sometimes it's best to go different directions. But it's also bringing that why. Why are these values important to us, and why do we live every day? I think are key, and they're becoming more and more. I was going to say more and more transparent, but communication is so all encompassing. They're just more evident.
It's true. And I think sometimes where there's a disconnect, and this is a big issue, but just to lightly touch on it, is when something's happening in the ecosystem, but it's not being named and openly discussed. That's when that sense of trust or transparency erodes. So again, if there's something the organization has to do that's hard, and there's a lot of those hard choices in an environment like ours that companies have to make, speaking about it, talking about how hard decisions can be commensurate with your values too, and allowing space for an employee body and individuals to kind of say, this doesn't feel good and I want to talk about it, but finding a way back to the why, as you said, that to me really is so much of that's why I really enjoyed having discussions like that with someone like Ethan.
Well, and even thinking about communicating with them where they are is a much more challenging question now than it was 5 years ago. You have some organizations that everybody is together; they're in one place, they're driving it. Others, a lot of companies that have industrial and manufacturing component, you have this divergent workforce that you've got hourly workers that are coming in every single day to work the machines to create the thing, while other people may be coming into corporate, or you have other groups that are really hybrid. And I guess going back to your conversation that you had with Chrissy Jones, we got some interesting feedback and some follow up that with questions about this idea of our hybrid structures for the communications function, not talking the corporation, but our hybrid structures for communications functions the best approach today to try and achieve both alignment and agility.
Yeah, and that alignment and agility, if people go back and listen to that episode, and I'm glad you circled back to it because you brought it up before and it's really germane. You had brought that up, that question of how do you have both alignment and agility? If the hypothesis is that having communications folks embedded in business units gives them greater alignment and intentionality, or does it give them more agility to move faster because they're closer to the customer? Or do you have better alignment if you have the centralized structure that's closer to the C-suite and less agility? Or does that make you more agile because you're closer to the center of power? And I've been thinking more about this, as you can tell, because there's a both and here. I do feel in discussing it with Chrissy and with others that that hybrid structure is probably powerful. And it's going to be different flavors and shades of gray for different companies. What does it look like? As you said, a manufacturer versus a knowledge worker type of organization. It's differently structured. But the idea that you need to think about, again, honoring your construct, Steve, alignment and agility, and it has to be both and in both settings. Alignment with the business unit and the customers, agility to move faster from the field, alignment with the C-suite and with the ultimate leaders, and agility to get to regulatory, legal counsel, make decisions, move fast, especially in a volatile reputation environment. I think that kind of comm structure with a respected senior leader close to, if not in the C-suite, is to me the sweet spot.
Yeah, and I think the conversation you and I are having with CCOs, both here in the States and globally, is just really reinforcing that. And when I think about and reflect on that concept of the hybrid structure, to me, it just really reinforces how important communications is to the very foundation of just how businesses operate today. Gone are the days that corporate communications is, we're going to push out a press release, we're going to manage a couple key stakeholders. It's really embedded in everything we do.
It is. And you can see how in larger entities, we work in healthcare, manufacturing, so many different fields. Communications manifests in different ways in different parts of the business. And yet it's so critical across so many levels. So yeah, I think it's a good conversation to have. The pendulum tends to swing back and forth relative to centralized, decentralized. But if we can embrace that both and two things being true at once, I think we're going to be in a much stronger place.
All right, now it's time to have a little fun. Let's go in our Wayback Machine. You remember at the turn of the year, we did an episode we called Navigating 2025, Essential Trends, Insights, and Checklists. Not much has happened in the world since January when we threw out our prognostication as to what was come. But the trends we had identified, they cut across AI, societal expectation, economic pressure. Never could we have imagined the daily disruption of the news cycles that we've been dealing, but that's the reality of where we're at. So let's step back and reflect and think, how are our predictions panning out now? We're just coming into Q4. Are our predictions accurate or not? And how should communicators prioritize anything when everything feels so essential at the moment?
All right, I'll bite first and I'll hand it back to you. It does feel the Wayback Machine. January does feel way, way, way back. I've been talking to so many people about what does time mean anymore. Just so much happens every day. So when I reflected back on our predictions, one thing I think that was very on spot was that this truly was the year that AI within organizations went from more exploration to enablement. Now, there's a lot of debate right now about how that enablement is going at the corporate level, at different sizes, et cetera. But I can see across our agency, across other agencies especially, and across many corporates, a huge movement forward and tangible leaps, tangible upskilling, embracing at different levels, not just coming from the top, but a lot of peer-to-peer engagement, a lot of use of tools. And we're starting to see more discussion of ROI which will be defined in many different ways. I see the media, even this week, I was reading today in one of the AI newsletters, like just this hard thing about like who is defining value. And JP Morgan Chase Jamie Dimon has come out with some details about that, about what they are seeing as ROI already. But I think ROI is going to look different, but I'm seeing more there. And then the other thing I would say is that some of what we've been expecting in January when we spoke has been even more intense and acute than we could have anticipated, as you said. And that includes societal and economic pressures. The landscape has put even more of an onus on how we communicate inside and outside our walls, how we're flexible, how we're resilient. So those are the things for me. But now back to you, Steve. You set a high bar in January around 3 branding strategies for 2025. So you could revisit those and share how your predictions are faring.
Yeah, I think like you, I was surprised by how quickly they accelerated. I think as I look back at our predictions, I still think we were remarkably on target for ours. But I've been shocked just by how fast and conversations that I've had with our friends at Muckrack and other AI is no longer a future bet. I mean, the acceleration curve there has been incredible that it's really definitely table stakes at this point. And we're really seeing a rapid evolution that the leaders are the ones using it to make customer experiences more human, more meaningful, not more efficient. And if you look at some of the adjacent spaces to ours, like advertising, things like that, it is incredible the amount of personalization that can be done, or even just the ability for large corporations to self-create some incredible things with AI. The second one, and I think this one will stay true forever. I kind of joke about, the first cave drawing was the first infographic, right? Water is good, it will nurture you. Bear is bad, it might eat you, right? Real. That was like the original foundation of storytelling. But we were right that value driven stories matter now, and the bar is higher, particularly when you get such chaos, such change. You need to have the receipts. Trust now comes down to really connecting stories directly to proof point and progress. And it is difficult, but you really have to really put everything together from point A to B to C. And then the last part of the predictions now feels truer than ever, that in a year as noisy as this one and as uncertain, clarity is currency. The brands that can simplify complexity and make it clear what their path forward is and why, going to that values thing we just discussed, those are the ones that are going to emerge as well. So I guess taken together, our predictions are still holding up, but we still have a quarter to go in the year. So we'll see when we get to December whether we feel like we've got there or not.
I love your point on clarity. I think even within our own group, which encompasses 2 agencies, we're trying to be very mindful and asking ourselves, what's the most important message we have to share? What's the most important thing we need people to understand or do? How do we strip back some of the stuff they don't have to worry about as much? And so I always feel that our group is a microcosm for experimenting and feeling out how, other things are resonating in organizations far larger than us. But yeah, I think keeping with the AI trend, though, I want to turn the tables with you. In an episode you did not too long ago with Lauren King of one of our agencies, Morgan Myers, and Matt Zugan, they talked to you about what AI is reading now. And there's a lot of focus on generative engine optimization. One of the questions we got from folks, and I have my notes here, if AI is being trained on digital exhaust, which is citations and links and mentions, I love that phrase, digital exhaust, does this create new incentives for content strategies that go beyond traditional earned, owned, and paid? So what were some of the things that you think about on that question? That was a really thoughtful question.
That was really good. And I think that the key point from that episode that just hit me right between the eyes is GEO is no longer optional. I mean, it is the new frontier of earned visibility. And that whole episode was based on Muckrack went and they ran a million inquiries to look at how the different engines, Chat, Gemini, others, how they were processing information. And what they found was it was incredible and actually incredibly refreshing as a communicator. Based on those million of inquiries, the data was undeniable. 95% of what the large language models are citing is not paid. That means that journalism, credible research, high authority content are now the most valuable digital real estate that you can have in your strategy. So, again, going back to that foundation of storytelling, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over time because it is a real shift. You still need advertising, you need paid, but it's that return to the delivery of the story. So every credible mention, link, citation, really what you're doing is you're teaching the AI brand what is a trusted source, what is not. So visibility has literally become uh, I'll call it algorithmic trust. There's a term for you for today. You know, so welcome to the matrix, right? We're now creating algorithmic trust. And all of this is shifting a little bit how we need to think about the term of content strategy. It's no longer just about the audience that we're trying to reach, but it's what are the machines that are reaching them in this zero click environment, right? And zero click environment, as you talked about, is hey, I put my query in and I don't need to go any deeper because you're automatically starting to get those AI summaries coming in there. So, what we need to do is think about how we can create content and stories and facts that are really citation friendly, high authority, timely, really structured. Basically, all those things that AI can reference and reuse. So, I know it's a long answer to a quick question, but to me, this means that our mindset needs to evolve, not just coverage for coverage sake, but coverage to earn credibility, which then goes into the data sets that shape what people see and believe. And I thought the other thing that was interesting that Lauren really talked about that is, as you know, we work in industries, I hate to call them niche because they're huge, like advanced manufacturing and healthcare and agribusiness. But since they're not part of a lot of these larger consumer sets, you can really have a much bigger impact on what shows up by being at the right places at the right time with the right credibility. So there you go. Visibility is algorithmic trust now.
I love it. Let's keep coining new language. The language is always evolving and you got to keep up with it. But I think there's some great points there. And it's been exciting to watch our teams digging into GEO or AIO, depending on what you want to call it, and seeing all of the reverberations of it and everything they can do with it.
Well, and you had a very similar conversation with Dan Nessel in your episode where you really talked about I think the term was earned attention, if I remember right. And there's so much talk about GEO and AIO and whatever acronym you want to give it in the context of earned media or PR. But it seems like this has broader implications on all digital marketing, on broader channel strategy. Why, in your discussion, did you guys really come to the focus on PR and what's been missing from this conversation?
Yeah, I brought up, Dan and I talked about the earned media implications. And then interestingly, I just did his podcast. It hasn't come out yet, The Trending Communicator. And we got into this point of the GEO conversation is very focused on what we understand to be public relations and earned media, and is sort of missing the broader digital marketing and channel strategy. Not entirely, but the bulk of it, I think, has been focused on earned media because of a few things. One is this feeling of where's the value of earned media in the broader marketing landscape and the comms landscape. And again, if you go back to what we talked about with comms earning a seat at the table, for a long time with the advent of digital marketing, and also just the preponderance of focus on anthemic campaign-based advertising back in the day. Think about Mad Men. There was a real focus on like the big ad campaign. What was the ROI that was going to drive? And then digital marketing, it kind of was like, oh, look, we cracked the code. We've got all this data. We've got click data and this data and audience data and time on site. And there was just this cascade of numbers that are very different from the kind of metrics that earned media produce. And there's been so much anxiety about that. So I think that with GEO, we always knew with SEO that there were high authority sites and that media outlets tended to be high authority sites. So this is not a completely new thing, and SEO has not gone away that way. people are kind of talking about what's the relationship with SEO and GEO. But I think right now, there's also, when you combine that with the trend of sort of the pressure on journalism, whether it's, an uneasy relationship, to put it lightly, with the current administration, with journalism, or just consolidation, loss of jobs, compressing of outlets, loss of outlets. There's this fear also about where's journalism going, because we need it in a society like ours. A democracy like ours needs a free and unruly and loud and boisterous and diverse press. So you've put these two things together where, wow, journalism is doubling down on its authority relative to what large language models are looking at, and not just media sites, but also, owned and other types of channels. And then you look at the fact of, wow, this is another evidence of how powerful this kind of work is relative to earning attention through earning media. I think there's a big conversation to be had here. So we can't miss, though, the fact that your on-page strategy, how you develop websites, how you build metadata, and then the digital marketing, how you're marketing through different channels, that also has tremendous impact with GEO. So we need to bring our arms around all of it. We are integrated marketing communications. That's what most of our clients are doing as well. We have to look at all pieces of the GEO puzzle. And I've been really proud of our teams because they've been looking at it through those three pillars: earned media, kind of digital marketing, and then that on-page development side.
Well, and you mentioned something I think that's really important, the making sure we have a free, robust, and boisterous press, which has become more difficult with news consolidation, the shrinking of the newspapers. One of the downsides about AI is it's writing a lot of local journalism right now, pulling from box sports for kids scores, things like that in sports. And there's also the challenge of just the heavier topics of trust and societal expectation and some of those things that you talked about. And in some cases, it's a little bit disheartening to hear from some fellow professionals, even some professional groups that are like, hey, the answer to this challenge is don't use the term. If you don't use the term, it's not an issue. Don't say ESG, just say, hey, we like the earth, like things like that. But earlier this summer, I mean, you and Cheryl Battles, what an incredible professional, what an amazing career Cheryl's had. But you guys really waded into some very heady and important stuff, and you're beyond acronyms, renaming DEI. And the title of the episode really challenged on just that, the challenge of acronym and the over reliance in the case of DE and I on the literal letters DE and I as the root of the problem. But isn't the real issue those that are working to deliberately misrepresent the concept, both for and against big issues like this?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that, and it was funny. One of the little, in terms of this reframing of DEI, we use the header from acronyms to acrimony. There's a lot of intensity around this, and I have a lot of feelings about this. I'm very open about what I feel is the tremendous business value of what I call the principles and the practices of diversity, of equity, of inclusion, of belonging, of a set of tools and a set of lenses through which to look at the world. And I always say to our people, part of this work is really becoming better managers. What's interfering between a manager and a managee? What are those things that are layered? Where do we misunderstand each other? Where does the idea of cultural competence across generations, across race, across gender, across every geography, all kinds of things, right? So, Cheryl and I really got into the fact that there's real practices here, real business value. But what we discussed, and you kind of hit on it with the ESG thing, humans love acronyms. We love acronyms. We just make them up all the time. It makes life easier. However, that shorthand is a double-edged sword. When you say ESG, environmental, social, governance, probably everybody listening here to us in the fields we're in knows that those three areas encompass a universe of different needs and practices and areas. Now, there's reasons why they were combined from a reporting and a stewardship perspective, and it has a lot to do with board governance, right? DEI, there's reasons why these practices have been grouped. And there's reasons why we went from just diversity, higher diverse folks representation. Oh, wait, we have to also add equity. Wait, we should also add inclusion and belonging. I know why these acronyms grow. But the heart of that discussion, and I really invite people to listen to because I'd love to hear their feedback, is when you reduce things to acronyms and you're not fully clear with people on the why, going back to what you said, Steve, why are we doing this? And it's not about taking something from one person to give it to another. And it's not about disadvantaging. It's actually about trying to say, how do we have people bring all their talent and represent the fullness of our customer base, of our employee base? How do we get better? How do we build trust? How do we remove friction? How do we fly? How do we create flourishing and abundance rather than lack and taking away? And it's sad to see how negative it's become. But I love, again, that we have this kind of platform to talk about the fact that AI is another one. AI is a billion different things. So if we just say AI, 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 are we really defining the why behind it and the usefulness of it? And I think as communicators, we need to guard against acronym laziness, right? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, 100%. It becomes really easy to get caught up in that, and then it also becomes really easy to say, well, just change the acronym, just change the term. And what I thought was interesting about and what you're talking about the why was when I talked to Rob and Elliot, I referenced that earlier. It was really that episode was about research that they did that showed only 1 in 4 still trust business to lead. And really, the core insight that we really talked about is action alone isn't enough. Just taking an action isn't enough. But when companies explain their why, confidence in business more than doubles from 26% to something like 53%. That's the difference between action and accountability. And so when you think about that, trust used to be earned in moments of crisis. Everybody talks about, okay, well, Tylenol, the crisis, they dealt with this. This is great. Well, now Tylenol is a whole different crisis that they're dealing with. That's a subject of a whole separate episode. But when we think about the topic of trust, now it's maintained through that pattern of proof. And ironically, when we talk about GEO and the large language model, you've got to do that constant pattern. It just can't be I address it once and then I don't worry about it. And the other thing we saw based on that research that we talked about is we really are seeing the impact of different generational lenses and what those generations are signaling. And again, one of the bigger ones coming through is younger audiences expect transparency to be table stakes. They'll forgive your mistakes, but not mixed motives. So that really comes to a point that you were talking earlier about what are those corporate values? What are those directions? Let's be clear about that, because I think that's what's going to be key is really marrying together consistency and courage. And that's not easy.
I love that. I think that's such a great build on what I talked about with Cheryl. And I think that's an interesting point, forgiving mistakes, but not motives, understanding what motivates you, even if it's hard and nuanced. But the fact is, I find younger people, they're up for that discussion. Give them that grace and get into the nuances. The shades of gray matter.
So I guess going back to where we started on our predictions for 2025 and where we're at, I mean, 2025 has been an exceptional year, I guess I should say. And I guess my question is, has 2025 been more about managing risk and uncertainties, or is it about seizing opportunities? And how should communicators strike a balance on those? And where do we go from here? I mean, I wake up every day. It's like those are the key questions. And from my perspective, it's really been a year of dual realities. I mean, risk management and reinvention. You've got to do both simultaneously, which is a unique challenge, but it's also in some ways it's very exciting to think about the need to deal with both, because particularly those of us in the agency world, but anybody in communications, you didn't get into this career to show up and do the same thing every day, stamping that envelope. And you said something really interesting in that January discussion, that the most effective leaders are the one you said are optimistic realist or realist optimists. It was one of those, but those that are really clear-eyed about the volatility ahead, but they're still moving forward with intentionality. And so I guess when I bundle this all together, and my advice to all our fellow communicators out there is uncertainty itself isn't the enemy, but ambiguity without direction is. And what we need to do is we need to be forward looking, pick a path ahead, and we've got to move. We just can't stand still.
Yeah, you're reminding me in terms of how I'd build on that. Just today, I really love Kara Swisher and her podcast On. She also has Pivot, but On is where she's interviewing, one or a few people. And she's just one of the strongest journalists working. She's very strong in a lot of ways. But she had Brene Brown on, the legendary, leadership guru, right? So they were talking about leadership. I think Brene has a new book coming out that I need to check out, but it's a lot about what she's learning from high functioning leaders in this moment, which is different than maybe the leadership when you and I were coming up 80s, 90s, like other times of leadership and who would say, oh, who's like the legendary CEOs. She said one of the biggest things people have to build as a leadership skill set is embracing paradox. Humans, again, are not really set to embrace nuance. We tend to move toward trying to clarify something, and it tends to be more binary thinking or zero sum thinking. Is it this or is it this? We rationally understand that two things can be true at once and often are, but sometimes, and when we kind of know that things may stay ambiguous and we have to make the best call we can, but this is not a natural state for people, especially at the emotional level. There's a distinctive difference between how we grasp something rationally and how we feel it in our bodies and how we manifest it, right? So in addition to embracing paradox, which is a leadership skill you need to practice, and it is that like two things are true at once, she discussed the importance of systems thinking, which I really appreciate. And she's like, I don't know why systems thinking fell out of style, and you can define it different ways, but it's a lot about in the midst of the churn, you have to step back and train yourself to try to look for larger patterns and systems at play, which also relates to DEI. So these are two pieces of advice, like living in the paradox and letting yourself be comfortable with that and saying, Kara actually said, yeah, she's like, people ask me what's going to happen. She's, I don't know yet. I guess we'll find out. And then looking at the systems. And those are two pieces of advice I'm definitely going to continue to embrace.
Systems thinking, you certainly had me there. And anybody who knows me knows I love a good model. So give me a four square, a Venn diagram, even a napkin to sketch on, and I'm in my happy place. But what I like about that is, models help us make sense of complexity. They give us a system, a mental framework where we can see connections where we may otherwise miss, and kind of make decisions from there. And so I guess as we're getting ready to wrap, and I think about, some of the through lines of the season so far, every topic we've explored, AI, trust, DE&I, brand, leadership, it's all part of this larger ecosystem that's just constantly shifting and changing. But the more we understand those connections and the better we can think where the linkages are, then I think the more effectively we can move with focus, with proof, with clarity to really do what we need to do, which is build trust and really have reputation be a business asset for our clients and for ourselves.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the name of this podcast, going back to the idea of brand gravity. What is pulling you in? What is bringing you to an idea, an organization, a leader, and how you create that through credibility and culture and clarity, and how that builds resiliency in times of uncertainty. So I want to thank our listeners for joining us on this special mailbag edition.
Mailbag.
Go back and check out the episodes we mentioned if you missed them. Share what's on your mind and keep sending us your questions and ideas. So thank you. Again, I'm Anne Green for Building Brand Gravity.
And I'm Steve Halsey. Have a great day.